Welcome to All the Best, an interview series with UNL ORCA awardees, where UNL means University of Nebraska Lincoln, and ORCA is the Outstanding Research and Creativities Award, which is UNL's top award. In Gerda Lerner's book, Why History Matters, she explains the life stories give meaning to the present and the future because we identify what is important to us. And she says, our stories show how we are interconnected in a particular time and place. As for this interview series, ORCA awardees have experiences that reach back more than a half a century, which will give us a personal view of how the best research emerged from UNL. It is my pleasure to introduce today's interviewee, Dr. Parks Coble Jr. He was awarded the ORCA in 2005. After I provide a quick summary of his life and career, Parks will tell us about his time at UNL, starting with his award-winning research. Parks was born in Waterloo, South Carolina in 1946, but grew up in Columbia. He earned his bachelor's in history at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. Next, he traveled 740 miles northwest to earn his doctorate at the University of Illinois in Champaign. In 1976, he became an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska, where he quickly rose through the ranks. His early work focused on the relationship between Chinese business elites and leaders of the Chinese national government movement during a very interesting time period in their history. From there, he moved on to the complex relationships between China and Japan. In 2019, Parks was honored by the Association for Asian Studies with a roundtable discussion at its annual conference to celebrate, quote, Parks Coble's important scholarly contributions to research in Chinese business, political, and social history. He retired in 2024 and still lives in Lincoln. With that, I want to welcome Parks to the interview.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. My favorite first question. What was your impression about the UNL campus when you saw it for the very first time? And then what do you think about it today?
Well, actually, it reminded me in some ways of Champaign, Urbana.
Oh, okay.
When I landed there in the middle of cornfields. But also, I had a one-year teaching job in Fargo, North Dakota. And so I drove the 500 miles from Fargo to Lincoln.
Oh, I missed that.
Yes, well, it's not a shocking transition. It says that in South Dakota, there's the Continental Divide of the North, where the interstate goes up about 35 feet or yards maybe. And but I was prepared, I guess is the right way to put it, and very happy. I was very excited to get a tenure track job at a Research One university, which were hard to come by.
Yeah.
They still are actually, but in those days especially.
I think 70s was hard, and then like 2000s were really hard.
Yeah. So.
How about today? What do you think about the campus today?
Oh.
What are your feelings?
Well, I have to confess, I don't want to start off on a negative note, but things aren't going well.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Economic problems.
Shocking as it may sound, when I got here 50 years ago, the Asian Studies Program and Committee was stronger, much stronger than it is today. We had faculty in political science, geography, music, literature, and anthropology, and now it's down to one or two people. So it's not good. If you wanted to know something about Asia, which is as important or more today than then, you would have far fewer classes available, which is really disheartening.
Yeah. So the Confucius Institute, I'm going to jump to a different kind of question. Was that sort of the time period where there were the most scholars on Chinese?
No, that was not really that helpful.
Okay.
What you need were tenure track lines.
Yes.
That's what, and what happened is, feels like political science. They considered a China or Japan specialist area studies, and they moved toward people working in different methodologies. And that happened in geography and a number of other fields.
I see. So let's jump right into your award-winning research. Tell us how it came about, and then what it is and why it's important.
Well, I have to give a little background on doing research in China altogether, because China changed a lot more than the United States. When I got to campus 1976, Chairman Mao was still alive.
Wow.
And he died a few weeks later.
Mm.
But China just was coming out of the Cultural Revolution. All the research institutes, universities, even elementary schools had closed with the Red Guards.
Mm.
So literally there was nothing being done or published in Chinese in China.
Mm.
And of course, the United States did not have diplomatic ties with China. We recognized Taiwan as the Republic of China. And so as a grad student, I didn't get to go to China mainland. I went to Taiwan for a year and a half. And that focused my research on the 1930s because the archives in Taiwan were from that period. So
I see.
actually, when I got to UNL, I never set foot on the China mainland. And you couldn't just go. You had to go as part of a friendship delegation. And so I did that not long after I got here and flew out to San Francisco, and we had our orientation. Then we flew to Hong Kong, which was still a British colony, and our national guide met us, and we traveled to Beijing and various other cities with the guide, local guide and the national guide. We stayed in friendship hotels, they were called, only foreigners. We actually had separate money, foreign exchange certificates. We called it monopoly money. And we shopped in friendship stores and ate in friendship restaurants. And so you went to China and you didn't really,
You're in a bubble.
and you didn't really meet Chinese. It helped that I read and spoke a fair amount of Chinese at that point, which I didn't always tell the guides. But it was actually only my third book that I actually went to China, really in the 1990s, and did significant research in Chinese archives and institutions. And then after that, until Xi Jinping came along, I was going to 2 or 3 conferences a year and meeting a lot of Chinese scholars. It was great. And then that kind of petered off a little bit.
So it's important for Americans to know about Chinese history? For what reason?
Well, I mean, first of all, to know about China. I mean, there's just no, the 1930s and 40s were a period that still sort of divides China because of Taiwan. And so it's still in play. But also in China itself, I think that the model of the 30s and 40s is kind of a model that people who want China to change, kind of are losing out in some ways, look to for more democracy and more openness, I guess you'd say. China was not a democracy in the 30s, but for various reasons, it was a lot more open. Most of the more interesting literature of the 20th century was published before the Communist Revolution in 1949. And a lot of the business practices that have resurfaced in China today were practiced back then. So
it's about a country's economic development. It's about China's continually changing role in the world.
Yeah, very much so. And but I focused a lot on partly on business and business organization. When Mao died, China was pretty much a controlled communist country. No markets, no stock market, no private business. But Deng Xiaoping brought back kind of independent businesses that resemble the capitalist enterprises of the 30s.
But they had to do it all with government approval, but they could still become millionaires.
Yeah, well, this is kind of that was actually my first book, was about the struggle of businessmen who wanted to make a huge amount of money and not pay any taxes, and the government's desire to control them and get them to pay taxes. And that's still kind of going on. Xi Jinping gets mad at businessmen, especially the high-tech people, when they're too uppity, as he looks at it. But the problem is that if he cracks down on them, That's where the economic growth in China is coming from.
Right.
So there's sort of an ongoing struggle. Sometimes these guys will disappear. Literally, they disappear from the internet and
Wow.
social contact, and then they reappear, and usually they have a confession, as it were, about how wrong they were, and this and the others. So it's I feel like the themes of my research are in the news all the
Right,
time.
I know.
Yeah. The other part of that news was the relationship between China and Japan,
Yep.
and that is ongoing. It's still a hot issue, and a lot of the fight actually is over history. This is in some of my later work, but I looked at the way war atrocities from the Second World War were handled and treated and promoted actually in China as a way of attacking Japan. But then the Japanese right wing also tried to rehabilitate some of the people that led Japan in World War II.
So how about Chinese, Taiwanese relationships? I mean, did you talk about that after the revolution?
I actually didn't deal. I mean, I lived through it.
Yeah.
Because I was living there.
Right.
And I went back there on a Fulbright. But I don't focus on that specifically, except to the extent that a lot of the issues and personalities are ones that I dealt with in my research.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I would go to China, Chiang Kai-shek was a leader of China in the 30s, and he was the arch enemy, the people's enemy, and all the bad things you could say about him. But then China decided they wanted to be a big power, and they were one of the big four allied powers in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem was the leader was Chiang Kai-shek.
Mm-hmm.
And so they, for example, promoted the Cairo conference in the 43, I think it was. John Roosevelt and Churchill all met in Cairo. And this was kind of a big deal for China. But how do you promote that without promoting Chiang Kai-shek? So it's kind of a schizophrenic.
It's a history problem.
Yeah, it is a history. Yeah, it's literally called the history question, actually, literally. And it comes in bubbles and so on
Sure.
from time to time.
The uncomfortable facts of history.
Yeah. So I've never felt that it's not like I'm working on the Tang Dynasty or something.
Right.
I never felt that what I was working on was in any way not centered on what's going on in China today, or at least related to it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right. All right. Let's tell us about one or two of your early graduate students or visiting professors, and what were their projects and what happened in their careers.
well, actually, I had very few graduate students here because we just didn't have the faculty for a full program. In history, we normally like to have 2 tenure line appointments for a field.
Mhm.
And we never really had that. I had some MA students and promising PhD students. I would usually try to get to go to, within the Big Ten, even before we were in it, there were several of these East Asian Studies centers, which are funded by the federal government.
Mhm.
I was funded in grad school by those.
Okay.
And
Through
so
the
we,
State Department or
actually, it was the National Defense Foreign Language
wow.
Act, which paid for,
haven't heard of that one.
no, well, it's kaput. They paid for study of enemy countries.
Okay.
So I was funded entirely through 4 years of grad school because I was studying Chinese
Ah.
language and people. And then after we became kind of friendly with them, they defunded the program.
Oh, wow.
So, but I tried to do that, but I got very cautious about pushing people into graduate school unless they really
Mhm.
were willing to make the sacrifice and realize that at the end, increasingly you got non-tenure line appointments, which could go on until they weren't there anymore. And I think they had to be really prepared for that. So,
Mhm. All right. So tell us how history defines impact. And what I'm trying to find out is during your annual evaluations, how did you justify your productivity? But then we're also going to follow that up and look at some of your most highly cited scholarly output.
Well, I don't want to sound egotistical, but by the standards we used, I never really felt I had a problem in that area because I published 3 books with Harvard and then one with California and then another with Harvard. And my last book was Cambridge.
Mm.
So I always had books that were well positioned and then they got reviewed and cited a lot.
Mm.
And I published in most of the leading journals. So I thought by the measure we used, I always seemed to get a good rating. Even though that often, the merit raise
Right.
often wasn't much of a raise.
Right. Many years.
A lot of praise, nice letter from the dean,
Yeah.
but
So we're going to look at some books here and paper. And the first one that I want you to comment on is the Shanghai Capitalist and the Nationalist Government, 1927 to 37. And this was published by Harvard in 1980. You did a second edition in 86?
yeah, paperback.
Paperback. And it was translated to Chinese in 1988 and then 2015.
Yes.
It has 359 citations, which is a very large number.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, that was based on my dissertation.
Okay.
And what it was, I worked at Illinois with Lloyd Eastman, who was a specialist on the 1930s.
Mm.
And I looked at the businessmen in the 1930s up to the Japanese invasion of 37. And there were a number of prominent families. And, China was not heavily industrialized, but they had a lot of cotton mills and textile mills and things like that.
Mm.
And I looked at them and their organization. They tended to have family-oriented firms. And I looked at some of their business practices, advertising and different things. And when I wrote it, was during the Cultural Revolution. And I thought it was very interesting research. It was one of those, I would say, you're on the junk heap of history like the Trotskyites. I'm studying capitalists who are no longer an issue in China. So I finished it, I revised it and got it published. And then, 86? Not long after it was published, Mao had died and Deng Xiaoping did what was called reform and opening.
Mm.
And almost immediately, China was way behind. They not only rekindled business operations, they actually invited a lot of the famous capitalists, many of whom had gone to Hong Kong or America or Latin America, and to come to China with their money and invest. And many of them did.
Oh, wow.
And so actually, John Fairbank at Harvard, who oversaw everything at Harvard, actually invited me to submit it was going to be a paperback edition, but with a new preface explaining how this is newly relevant. And in fact, that whole issue of Chiang Kai-shek wanted business development, but he also wanted to try to get as much money out of the capitalists as he could to fund his military, because he was mostly funding the communists and then later the Japanese. And so he was kind of in a tussle, trying to get money out of them, and then they would try to resist. And that basically is what happened in China with the reform and opening.
So how did it come about that you had Chinese translations? Was it Harvard that made those?
No, well, they had to get permission.
Yeah.
But no, I had Chinese. The real reason is that even after China opened up a bit, the academic community in China was still under a lot of political pressure. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, if you had one footnote that
Right.
took somebody off, you could be in a labor camp.
History is so dangerous.
Yeah, it is actually. Well, most of the people that I knew had a hard time in the Cultural Revolution. But as a foreigner, I could get away with saying a lot. And so I think that was one of the big draws. I was much more a typical Chinese book at the time that was published would start off with praise for the Communist Party and Mao and blah, blah, blah. And then usually, like they were doing, say, textiles in Shandong province, they would have a very detailed, very dry account of academic statistics. And I would have all this political stuff, that the communists weren't really doing very much. And I could get away with that. And I think that's what the big draw for my book was. And when private conversations, that would all come out,
So the citations on Google Scholar are mostly from journal articles, so it's not books. And do you have a sense of the citations? Do they come from the U.S. or from China or from elsewhere?
I think they're from China and Great Britain.
Okay.
Mostly. The Chinese editions are cited, but I don't think Google Scholar
Yeah,
recognizes those. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they might get there, but
I don't know.
so
Mostly when I go to conferences, people come up and say they read my book. And the first or second academic conference I went there, after it was published, a scholar came up and said that, I read your book. It was so exciting and interesting. And he was speaking in English. He said, I got a copy of the English edition and I looked at the Chinese translation and here's all the stuff they left.
Oh, no.
And so, the second edition in Chinese, 2015,
Yeah.
had to be no omissions or no mistranslations. And it actually was done not long after the first one, but it didn't get political,
No.
the political okay until 2015, which is quite a while.
Wow.
So,
That's something. All right, let's talk about the second most cited one, Facing Japan, Chinese Politics and the Japanese Imperialism, 1931 to 37, again, published by Harvard in 91 with a second edition or paperback, I assume, 2020, and then a Chinese translation.
yes. When I did the first one, I noticed that the big thing looming over China was the threat from Japan at this time. In 1931, Japan invaded northeast China, Manchuria, and seized control and set up a puppet government. And then the right wing in Japan took over in the 30s. And ultimately this led to the all-out war in 37. But they were a constant factor, and I thought, I really need to go back over this period and look at that as a political issue. And what I looked at was there was a huge, I call it public opinion. It was not peasants in the field, but among urban residents, especially students, college students, deeply angry at Japan. But Chiang Kai-shek was trying to appease Japan at this time. He said we have to unify China internally, which is defeat the communists, not resist them externally. But I think Chiang Kai-shek had studied at a military academy in Japan, and but he recognized that the Japanese military was totally superior to China. And when he did resist, which he finally had to do, they got creamed. I mean, their navy was sunk in one afternoon. They lost control of the air, and they retreated hundreds of miles inland to Chongqing or Chongqing, as we called it. And he held out for the war 8 years, but much of the coastal area was occupied by the Japanese. And I think he anticipated that. But he was caught in kind of a limbo, politically unpopular, but realistic policy of appeasement.
Amazing. All right, then the third most cited book, Chinese Capitalists in Japan's New Order, The Occupied Lower Yangtze, 37 to 45, University of California Press, 2003.
Yes. That book, I moved on to the war itself. It took me, I spent 25 years studying the first decade. Now I'm moving on.
Right.
But the war is a very different period. One of the issues that came up was Chinese who collaborated with the Japanese. There was a puppet government, and they were routinely criticized in China. And a lot of the capitalists, it was a little shady what they did in the war. And it had not been really discussed that much. What the mainland did was open up archives in the 1980s and 90s. And when they socialized enterprises in China, 49, they confiscated all of their business records. So they were in the archives. So actually, once they opened them up, you could see the inner workings of businesses. If you wanted to do, like history of Ford Motor Company, they control their archives. You can't always. But in China, all of the dirty laundry was there, and it was pretty dirty. The 37, Japan invaded China and occupied most of the coastal areas, but the foreign enclaves like Hong Kong or Shanghai, the international settlement, Japan did not invade those until after Pearl Harbor.
Oh.
So they were kind of little islands.
Make a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the capitalists stayed there or in Hong Kong because it was safer than being in Chongqing was being bombed and air raids and all of that. And also, but they began doing business, and they would do business with occupied China, the Japanese areas, and then with free China, as it's called, the nationalist areas, and they would try to hide all of that. And because I've already done this work, I had a good idea of how some of these families were. Like one capitalist had several sons, and he sent 2 of them to Japan for college degrees, 2 to America, 1 to Britain, 1 to Germany, and that's how they operated.
Wow.
The ones who studied in Japan spoke Japanese. They worked in the occupied areas, and
Wow.
and they covered a lot of that up because they didn't particularly want it to come out. But I revealed a lot of it.
Oh, wow. It's amazing. That sounds like hard information to get, though.
Well, if the thing is, when they opened up, capitalists always by the communists been considered enemies of the people and all this stuff. So they had all this stuff in there, and they didn't really sanitize it.
I see. So they're telling the tale of this person. Here's an
Yeah.
example of somebody who's really.
But they never did a lot of analysis because they weren't into doing that at the time. So they would say things like I was a rubber company that made rubber slippers, which was a big industry in China at the time. And they said, well, most of the rubber, this was before synthetic, came from rubber plantations in Vietnam, which were occupied by the Japanese. And so they couldn't get any rubber. But luckily, they were able to find a client who was able to get rubber for them. And as you read into it, they made rubber slippers for the Japanese occupation.
Oh, my God.
It's all, but they didn't
Make
present it
money
like
anyway,
that.
yeah.
They just said they were able to get the rubber. Well, yeah, of course. They're the army.
Wow.
So it was very interesting research to do.
All right, let's talk about this highly cited paper. This is after you got the ORCA, China's New Remembering of the Anti-Japanese War of Resistance, 37 to 45, published in 2007 with 190 citations in China Quarterly.
Yes, well, that's a very widely circulated journal, and that went on to be a book.
Oh,
more or less at the same title.
okay.
Which I fleshed out all of these, and this had to do with in the communist period under Mao, they basically, in remembering the war, and you have to remember 20 or 30 million people died in China during the war, mostly civilians. So it was a big issue. They couldn't say anything good about Chiang Kai-shek, so they had to praise the communists. Well, the fact is, communists were up in the Northwest and they did not play a huge role. I mean, they did fight the Japanese, but it wasn't the dominant feature. And so they would have to leave out a lot of the stuff like the Pacific War, and
Wow.
and also early on under Mao, they had to praise the Soviet Union. Now they broke with the Soviet Union in 1960, but they praised the Soviet Union and they couldn't say anything good about Britain or America, which is kind of hard to.
Yep.
So, like for example, the end of the war, they skirt over the atomic bombs,
Oh, wow.
but they focus on Japan's declaration of war against Japan, which occurred 2 days after the Hiroshima atomic bomb,
Oh,
because Stalin wanted to get in there and grab the territory, which he did.
oh.
So it was a very unrealistic, and so gradually, the new remembering is the government loosened things up and they allowed them to remember more of the things that Zhang did. And part of this was wanting to make China, they project China as one of the big four allied powers that defeated fascism.
Mhm.
And ultimately they got permanent seat in the Security Council of the UN as one of the five.
I see.
I mean, they threw France in, but it was the big four in China,
Mm.
Soviet Union, America, and Britain.
Mm.
And they wanted to glorify that. And so they started having to praise Chiang Kai-shek a little bit. And it's kind of schizophrenic because they would do a little bit of praise and then there would be a drawback on it. But like the Cairo conference, I mentioned that. And when Xi Jinping came along, they really kind of tightened that up a little bit, but it's still there because the government wants to project China as a world power.
Mhm.
And that the stepping stone for that was their being part of World War II.
Right. Wanted to control the view of their own past.
Right.
Which of your creative works do you remember the most, and why is it memorable?
Well, I mean, I would say the last one because I just finished it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that may be. But I guess I've sort of rehashed all of them. I hadn't read the first two for some time, and when they did that conference panel in my honor, I had to go back and read them.
Oh, wow.
Because people were commenting on
Wow.
on what was in those books.
Mhm.
When I retired, the department had a symposium in my honor
Oh, wow.
the fall after I retired, and it was called the Poly Symposium, and they invited 5 scholars to come and over a 2-day period give papers commenting, and these are people I knew,
Mhm.
and commenting on my work, and then I had to respond to all of that, so I had to reread them all over again,
Well, let's talk about that Association for Asian Studies and that conference. So what happened when they honored you in 2019?
Well, I think there was a rumor I was going to retire. And I had sort of planned on retiring, and they thought it's not uncommon in someone who's been around for a while.
Sure.
And so the people who organized it were, mostly friends. And we actually tried, we had 2 people my age, and then 2 mid-career and 1 assistant professor, so that there would be a variety. It was it was well attended, and I was honored by it.
I
So
think it's amazing.
yeah. But then I didn't retire. I'm not sure why. One of the reasons I realized that if I retired, China would leave the building. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
I mean, and I had students but I think the other thing was COVID.
Mm.
I was probably the least online person in the department because I'm the oldest, and I don't know whether you probably remember, I'm sure we left for spring break and they turned it into 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then they said, when you come back, you've got to do online.
Yeah.
And I had to take courses, and I spent hours and hours learning how to do that. And once I got all the courses set up, I thought, well, I've done all this work, and it really, once you get it set up,
Yeah.
it's not that hard. So I thought, well, I'll make this a little bit long.
Yep.
And I was finishing up the last book, and I had a research chair that provided travel support, which I really needed. Not only going to China, but I did a lot of work at Stanford at the Hoover Institute,
Okay.
which is a very expensive place to work.
Yeah. So, it's complicated to be a professor. You've got all these things to do and then interact with other people. Any curatorial activities, editing books or society leadership?
Yeah, I did a lot of that, I guess. I was never chair or vice chair of the department, which I held out. But I was graduate chair 3 different times because I had fewer graduate students, and there was a little competition in the department between the Americanists and the Europeans and the military historians, and, and I was viewed as neutral because I didn't have access to grind. And also, how can I put this, with a reasonable personality, which I don't know how many historians from that period you knew, but there were some who were hard to work with. I mean,
I knew 1 or 2.
Yeah. And so I had a greater ease working with some of the grad students. But I did work in the Asian Studies Association. I was on the national board for a while, and I've gone to almost all the Asian Studies conferences. And then I worked in the Midwest branch. I was president and vice president, past president, and on the board, and we published a journal that I was on the editorial board for, and I'm also on the editorial board of another journal called 20th Century China, which I'm trying to ease out of now. So I did review a lot of book manuscripts and review for tenure from other schools.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Not to mention in-house.
Right. Absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit how your research was funded, but go over what they were again, and then how did it change over time?
Well, I actually have had very good funding all the way around. A lot of it came through the Research Council of the university.
Okay.
And you had to apply, and I got a fair amount of funding. I had a Fulbright, or the equivalent, to go to China a couple of times, and then I got some other the Ford Foundation funding was available. And then I got the research chair, the John and Catherine Angle. Well, it's the Sellers chair. That was Catherine Angle's father. And they were well-to-do people who lived in Lincoln, and they donated a lot of money to different things. And they actually funded 3 chairs in the history department, which is pretty amazing. And that came with a research stipend, which is
$10,000 or?
Yeah, around that. Yeah, it was enough. I could do a couple of China trips, or I think I did a month at Stanford one time. I actually stayed on campus, which was still expensive. But on the hand, I've never seen what they called a dorm. Stanford was what I would consider a luxury apartment, but
Yeah.
But anyway, I got a lot of work done with that, and I did a lot of work at Harvard at the Harvard Yanjing Library. So I had good support all the way through.
So how does a historian do research, right? So I've got a lot of listeners who they're not particularly interested in any one academic discipline, but in history, what does it mean to visit an archive, and how do you find out which archive to go to?
Well, I think actually it's word of mouth. The China field is relatively compact in the sense that the sort of American history, they could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And so you kind of know where they are. But they also are a moving target. The first 2 books, I never thought any chance of working in a Chinese archive. And then they kind of opened up, and sometimes they're open up and sometimes they're not as open.
Mhm.
But you have to get permission and invited. But after you've gone to China a few times, you would meet people. And particularly my books being in Chinese, I'm not just some unknown person. And one of the things that you do in China, I would go to conferences. You take your books and present them, and then they give you books in return. The academic market in China is not that commercial. So a lot of times, that's how you get books. And I would take a suitcase full. And once I had Chinese editions, I mean, they'd like to get an English edition, but most Chinese scholars don't read it that well. So that was a big help. But I went to Stanford when I was a graduate student. I was told that the Hoover Institution, for various reasons, ended up getting a lot of stuff related to the Nationalist Party and Chiang Kai-shek. And when I went there, they had a scholar, a woman who had been with the American occupation forces in Japan. And she managed to get all of the intelligence documents the Japanese occupation army had, many of which were in Chinese. Others, I'd studied some Japanese. And that was at the Hoover. And they were there to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of stuff there. But for example, the diaries of Chiang Kai-shek were available at the Hoover Institution.
Okay.
And his two brothers-in-law, T.V. Song, Madame Chiang Kai-shek's brother, and her brother-in-law, H.H. Kong, were key financial people. Their papers were there.
Mm.
Song's papers were 76 rolls of microfilm. But at Hoover, they let you could do digital copying, and I could just go through some of the stuff, and then I emailed everything back to Lincoln that in the evening so that it didn't disappear.
Yeah, right. Well, that's amazing.
So that worked out very well. But, it's doing work in China is expensive, and there are often limits that pop out. So you get over there, and in Nanjing or Nanking, the archives related to the puppet government of China during the war went there, and I wanted to work there, and then they decided to close the archives to foreigners.
Mm.
And then eventually they closed them to all scholars for a while.
Wow.
So I didn't get any work done there, but I found the records of the businesses, which turned out to be maybe more interesting. So
someday, maybe, right? Somebody's got those records somewhere. All right. So research is cooperative and competitive. And were any of your creative works ever co-opted? Did somebody beat you to the punch, or?
No, I was ahead of the game. I really think. I think that I came in at the right time. And I mean, there were other people working in the field, but not that many people worked on what I was working on. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in the 20 years after I started doing some of this stuff, there was a blossoming of this. I mean, mostly in China. I mean, some in the States. Mm-hmm. But the key thing for historians is archives. And because a lot of this stuff opened up, young scholars in American universities and British began to work in a lot of these areas. But I think my timing was good.
Mm-hmm. How about controversies? So again, your work is revealing things about the Chinese workings, and yet they still let you work there.
Yes.
Doesn't make any sense.
Well, the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing. I think that that most Chinese scholars, a lot of them have been through a lot in the Cultural Revolution, and they're eager to work with you, especially early on. And the people in the political side of thing are further up the ladder, but they don't always keep up with everything.
So there's an official position, but then they allow activity to go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless
Those activities talk to each other.
Oh yeah, they do. Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping has kind of cracked down a little bit, but you notice that translation of the first book.
Yeah.
The second one came out in 2015. That was the authorized.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an example right there. Yeah.
But it took somebody somewhere. I think what happens at the political side is somebody has to sign off, and they're very worried if they sign off and then somebody higher up, in the party discovers that his uncle is bad-mouthed. But I still get, in the last couple of years, twice I've had people more or less my age or younger write me, they're ethnically Chinese who live in America, about their grandfather, the two different grandfathers, because it's mentioned in my book, and they kind of wonder.
Really? Neat.
And this one guy, I'd met him before, came to the States at the time of the Communist Revolution, and he was 5 years old, and he met his grandfather, but no one in the family ever talked about what he did.
No.
And I had revealed that he had sort of collaborated with Champaign, and he seemed he wanted to know more about it, basically.
No. Again, history is complicated, right?
It is complicated, yeah.
So we've talked about your society activities and your sabbaticals. How about service contributions to the department, the university, the community, nationally? Which ones do you remember most?
Well, I would have to say, I had a lot of stuff in the department. You just have to, as a full professor, and grad chair. That took up all kinds of time. But I guess the Asian Studies Committee and program, a lot of which is defunct. We had an Asian Studies Committee, which I don't know even exists anymore. It was kind of grabbed by Global Studies. That sort of disappeared.
Right.
But we met maybe every month. We would go and try to coordinate our academic offerings and promote different activities. And we got some funding from the university. And then we had, for a time, kind of a China scholars group. A lot of our programs with China Exchange were actually on East Campus.
Oh.
They pioneered a lot of the ag, and they're very global.
Yeah.
We were importing or exporting swine sperm to Sichuan, and so that these people would go to China and didn't have any real knowledge of China, and so we would often get together and talk. And they also seemed to have more money, so they would host luncheons on East Campus for us. And so at one point, Ronald Oskins, who came to our meetings for a couple of years.
Wow.
So, and it was a fun group because they all had interests in China, traveled there, and some of the people had Chinese graduate students. And so it was, but that sort of died out, as our office in Xi'an. We had the Xi'an Jiaotong University Exchange that folded, and so there was less and less going on. And Siping Liu in the library just retired, and we were reminiscing about those luncheons that we had. And then there was the Lin Center for Asian Culture. I don't know whether you ever.
Yep.
I was with the group at Don Lentz in Velma, who Don was former leader of the Cornerstone Marching Band, and they've been to Asia many times, and they set up a group that put programs trying to promote Asian studies. And then we got the Lentz Center, and it had problems from the beginning in terms of funding and the collection. It was in Elephant Hall, Morrill Hall, for a while, and that was really good because it got a large number of visitors. who just walked in as school kids and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And then they moved over to the basement of what is the Center for Great Plains Studies, and the visitors dropped off. But I took my class over every semester. I'd take them over sometimes twice, and they would have objects on display, but they would have Tibetan monks come in and do a sand mandala in Shan, and it was good. And then
I actually remember that.
yeah, and then Perlman decided to save money and closed it.
Yeah.
So,
Nope.
and the collection, some of it is in the library, but there's no curator, so a lot of it's misidentified, and I think the rest is in storage. A little bit of it is in the Kawasaki reading room.
Oh.
They don't have a lot of space. That's probably been the one element that I just 2 weeks ago I was at a program at the Kawasaki room, and I donated almost all my books on Japan. I taught Japanese history, all my books on Japan to the Kawasaki. So,
Now, that'd be frustrating.
but they have money because of Kawasaki voters.
Yeah. How about courses? Which ones did you teach more often than others? And then what are your thoughts about the need to teach those courses?
Well, I taught one course every year that I was here, History 181,
Okay.
which is East Asian Civ.
Okay.
And that was a core curriculum course that covered basically China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam from the Stone Age to about 1800. Needless to say, I picked highlights like the coming of Buddhism and, different things. But that always had, there were a lot of students who took it as part of a group requirement in history or something. But I had a lot of students, like they were interested in Asia. And I had an increasing number of students who were first generation Asian Americans.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually added more on Vietnam because,
A lot in Nebraska.
1 year I had 8 students in the class named Nguyen, that all. And then we got students from China coming in for a while, and they thought since they already knew it, they could.
Easy, eh?
But unfortunately, first of all, a lot of essay writing, so they weren't good. But also, it turns out students in the sciences and engineering
Right.
have only had Chinese history, like maybe in middle school. I was shocked at what they didn't know. But anyway, that was part of it. And then the other one was 282, Modern East Asia, which was from 1800 to the present. And I changed that much more dramatically. I had a lot of Vietnam, and I added, a lot happened from 1976 to the
That's
present.
a huge part of the work.
Actually, in the upper division, I had a class called Modern China at the senior level, which was China from 1800 to the present. And after I'd been here about 30 years, I realized that over half the class was stuff that happened after I got here. So I added China since the death of Mao as a new class, and discovered I could fill it up easily, and I had a lot of students. But I always had, there were always a lot of students who were really interested in Asia, wanted to go to Asia, global studies students, and then the first generation and
Many business students.
oh yeah, I forgot that, I guess. International business.
Yeah.
It was funny when I sort of got going. At that time, Japan was the model.
Yeah. Right.
And so international business students were interested in Japan.
Right.
And then in recent year, all China. And then the Japan people are all anime and
Right, I know, yeah.
kind of stuff.
Cute.
Totally different clientele. But I tried to cater to whatever was there. So.
But how about interest in trading with Vietnam and Thailand and
I didn't do Southeast Asia
Okay.
except Vietnam.
Yeah.
But no, that was kind of secondary.
Okay.
I did have a lot of ethnically Vietnamese students who had family back in Vietnam, and one time I was flying to China, and the flight to Tokyo was connecting a student from my class who was going to get married in Vietnam, to a woman he had never met,
Oh,
arranged marriage. And so I wished him luck. He said, my family knows, so,
right.
but, so there was always that. And, but I guess that was part of the thing. The students I interacted with changed to different groups, but they were always very interesting
Mhm.
and kind of kept me young, I think.
Mhm. Great. Let's go on to your youth here. Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Wow. Well,
South Carolina boy.
yes, I was born in Walterboro.
Yeah.
Yes, which has been somewhat famous because the murders occurred there, Colleton County. But Dad moved to Conway, which is near Myrtle Beach, become superintendent of schools in Horry County. And then when I was in the third grade, we moved to Columbia,
Mm.
where he was head of the South Carolina Education Association, which is the teachers' lobbyist group, really. And so I grew up in Columbia,
Okay.
went to University of South Carolina, and
And so he must have had a college degree.
oh yeah, Dad had master's degree. So did Mom. Actually, they were
Okay.
both educators. Mom was a
Okay.
school teacher.
Okay.
So we were very education focused, I
Right.
guess. But I think when I was an undergraduate at the University of South Carolina, 1964 to 68, that was the height of the Cold War. And I think I gravitated toward communist countries, I guess.
Sure.
I actually studied in Russian language and history, and then Yale hired the Russian historian away from South Carolina right before the start of my senior year.
Mm.
So I began switching to China.
Mm. So what is Columbia, South Carolina like?
Actually, I would say it's maybe closer to Omaha.
Mm.
It is a state capital, but the metro is pretty large. It's certainly different from,
Mm.
it's about 1/3 black, 2/3 white with a Hispanic now.
Okay.
And so that was a difference. And of course, I went to segregated schools till I got to college.
Mm.
Kind of hard to believe now, but I sometimes feel like a relic. Graduate students in history here would interview me. What was it like?
Yeah. Right. And then going to Champaign, how did you choose to do that?
Well, when I applied for grad school, I had one handicap. I had not studied any Chinese. And I think realistically that limited my options. But the teacher at South Carolina was a new young faculty member. And he recommended, there were several schools in what is the Big Ten, I guess it was then, yeah, that had these Asia Studies Centers, heavily funded by the federal government because they're studying the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you can get money. So I applied and got into Michigan and Nebraska and Illinois.
Okay.
And Michigan had the stronger program, but he said that what you don't know is the most important thing in grad school for a doctorate is your PhD advisor and your relation with him. And he said, the guy at Michigan, it's a better overall program. He said, I know both of them personally, and I won't mention the guy's name. He's kind of a jerk. And Lloyd Eastman is a great scholar and a great human being, and you'll enjoy working with him. And that turned out to be true.
Oh, okay.
When the guy at Michigan retired, they were going to do a festival, for him, and a lot of his grad students wouldn't participate.
Oh, no.
Well, that's
Oh, ouch.
yeah. So I think that was really one of those lucky.
I hope those sorts of people are less populated in our.
Well, I hate to say it. That wasn't. I mean, there are people here
Yeah.
who I think are no longer around in Lincoln that, as human beings, would not have.
Right.
They just weren't when you are grad chair, you really know what people are like. What people are super selfish and aren't going to help you out and don't help their grad students out. And I knew that and I worked around it.
Mhm. And we aren't really trained to be mentors.
No,
And there's no advantage.
no, that's one of the key, actually. If you are nasty and you don't have any grad students,
yeah.
it saves you time for your own research.
Absolutely.
You know, I think a lot of people figure that out, but I had to take a course at Illinois in how to teach history. And that course is always given to the person least qualified to teach it. It's punishment. But the guy came in the first day and he said, teaching his undergraduates history is like throwing fake pearls to real swine. And that was his attitude to teach undergraduates. So,
okay. And then Champaign, you learned how to speak Chinese and read Chinese?
I studied Chinese the whole time I was there. And then when I went to Taiwan, the first 6 months, I went there a year and a half paid for by the Ford Foundation, actually, that one. And I studied Chinese exclusively there and then did research. But I've studied Chinese every day of my life, really, because since I retired, I'm sure I've forgotten more Chinese characters than I knew.
Great. Let's see. And then you did 1 year in North Dakota. How did that happen?
Well, there was a job, basically. I finished my PhD and I had no job. There were not many jobs at that time. And it happened that they had someone who taught Chinese and Russian history, and he was on sabbatical for a year.
I see.
And I could teach Russian history as well. I did. I got the job, and it's one of those good old boy things. The dean there was very close friends with a faculty member and the chair of the history department here in James Raleigh. And so he called when I was, and that got me the on-campus interview. And I think that made all the difference in the world. You know, that often is the case.
And so let's see. What was your very first creative work? Was it a paper?
Yeah, I'm sure it was a graduate paper that I wrote. It wasn't published.
Oh,
And it was a seminar paper.
okay.
The first one I did where I used Chinese sources, which is tough to do when you're starting out. Still is. But I would say when I got here, I realized the only way to get tenure was to publish the book. So I focused entirely on getting it revised. So.
Oh, that sounds good. And then in retrospect, how far did your academic work diverge from your graduate work?
Surprisingly very little. With Lloyd Eastman, I got situated in this Republican period, which is kind of in its infancy.
And did he previously focus on that part of?
No, when he started out, he worked on the Qing Dynasty period.
So you were the guy that started this thing.
Well, no, he moved into the.
Okay.
He had wanted to do the Republican period, but it was very hard to get any sources when he started out. So he did Qing Dynasty. But he told me that he thought that this would be a field that would, and at the time working on anything after 1949 was impossible. The political scientists who worked on it then, Cultural Revolution, you couldn't go to China. If you got to China, all the people there were in labor camps, that people interviewed refugees in Hong Kong. And so he said, in Taiwan, they're starting to open up a lot of this material and at Hoover. And so he convinced me this was the way to go. And I never looked back. It seemed to be very productive.
Yeah, it does sound like it. Good timing, though.
Good timing. Timing is everything.
So move on to the personal here. How about your family? Did you have children?
No, I'm single.
You're
so my whole life were these books, my
Yeah.
children. So,
Yeah.
a
lot of focus.
yeah, I just went to a family reunion, and my brother has 15 grandchildren, so there were enough to go around. So 5 in diapers,
Oh my God.
but I drew the line at changing a diaper, right?
Oh wow. Before retirement, what did you do for relaxation or entertainment?
Well, believe it or not, looking at me now, I got involved with a running group here in Lincoln, and I ran a marathon in every state in the union,
Wow.
77 altogether.
Wow.
I blew out my knees with
Oh,
of a cane, but we had a lot of fun. We'd do these trips, like we go to Alaska and do cruises and have a good trip. And it was a lot of fun, a lot of good people in that group. And they're still my closest friends outside the university.
Are they your vintage?
Some, unfortunately, several are older and passed on, but mostly. And when we get together, which we're going out to dinner next week, it's very medical. Knee replacement, hip replacement, elbow, And then at some point somebody says, okay, enough of that. We have to talk about something else. But,
Yep. And well, I guess we have reached the end.
okay.
Thank you very much for talking to me today.
I enjoyed it. It was fun to reminisce about all of this stuff. So,